Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to 2-Minute Talk Tips. This week's tip, sit up while speaking. It's always best to stand when presenting, but that's not always feasible. For example, in a webinar or on another important phone call, you might be operating your computer while you speak, in which case you're more likely to be sitting at your desk to run your equipment. If that's the case, at least sit up. We're often told that people can hear our facial expressions and posture in our voice. The bosses at call centers will often tell reps to smile while they're on the phone for that very reason. Posture affects the shape of your torso, the way air moves through your bronchial tubes and over your larynx, and it affects the whole sound of your voice. For example, when I lean back in my chair like this and slouch, my voice actually changes. It comes more from my throat and less from my diaphragm. And you can actually hear a little more vocal fry in my voice, and that's something that annoys a whole lot of people. You can even see the difference in voice in the waveform of the audio recording. And if you'd like to see that, be sure to head over to 2minutetalktips.com/waveform, which will also point to 2-Minute Talk Tips episode 25, the show notes for this episode. And you can actually see the visual difference between the two styles. Now I'll sit up again, and you can hear the difference there. Suddenly my voice has a little bit more resonance. It may even sound a little bit louder. The key is to make your voice more powerful and effective for a webinar, a conference call, a job interview, or another important phone call. Channel your inner preschool education and sit up straight. Stick around, and after the break, we're going to talk about storytelling. Begin this week's post-tip discussion with a story about retail. A few years ago, I was teaching folks how to sell laptop computers. A retail salesperson came up to me afterwards to share his experience. Now, this was back when backlit keyboards were still fairly new, and they were only available on higher-end machines. He told me about a customer who came in to buy an inexpensive computer. She wanted to spend about $300 or so. The salesperson was going to show her some relevant options. As he did, he bumped another machine and the keyboard lit up. She asked, "What is that?" The salesperson explained that the keys light up so you can type in dark places. She said, "I'll take it," and spent $500 more than she planned to just for that one feature. As the salesperson took care of her, she explained why that one feature made that decision so easy. See, she needed a laptop because she was going to use it for work. Her mother was suffering from cancer and only had a short time to live. Unfortunately, the customer couldn't afford to take time off from work, so she arranged to work remotely. Because the keys lit up on that computer, that meant she could now work in her mother's room while her mother slept. She could be there and help out as needed in her mother's final weeks. That computer wasn't a collection of processor specs and RAM and ports. That's not what she bought. What she bought in the store that day was extra time with her mother. Time she wouldn't have without that computer. Time with her mother that became more precious and valuable every day. I often tell this story when I do sales training. I like the story itself for several reasons. First, it changes the pace of a presentation or a lesson that I'm conducting. Often when doing a speech, it's easy to get into a cadence. There is a sense of work to learn this stuff and practice the material. It's very easy to get caught up in the bullet points and lessons a speaker is trying to teach as we focus on trying to collect as much information as possible. Knowledge acquisition can feel very tactical. And then when I launch into this story, my pace changes. and the focus of the room changes. The audience finds itself paying more attention as I change the feel of the room. One tool that speakers have to keep an audience engaged is to vary speaking pace. That doesn't have to be at the sentence level. It can be at the bigger, broader level. And a story like this really changes the pace and can help re-engage an audience, especially if they start to drift off later in the afternoon. Second, it demonstrates the emotional power of stories. I mean, I could go ahead and list all the features of a bunch of computers or even all the places that a backlit keyboard might be useful, and my audience might actually remember some of them. With a story like this, though, I may have shared fewer technical details, but the audience will remember more of what I told them because I engaged both logical and emotional parts of their brains as they relate to the customer and imagine how they would feel in that place. They can also relate to the salesperson who has had a notable impact on a stranger's life. And that's the next reason I like this story. It illustrates how what we do matters. Even a frontline retail salesperson making $10 an hour can have a major impact on a person's life. Because he was there, because he explained that simple feature, that customer got hours with her mother she would not otherwise have had. What we all do matters. And fourth, I also tell this story because it illustrates the difference between features and benefits. And this is one of the most important lessons a new salesperson can learn. This is why brick and mortar stores are still relevant. There's a reason a customer goes to a physical store instead of just reading a feature list online. This is also an important lesson for speakers. It's why we speak instead of just sharing lists of bullet points. Benefits in a sales context translates into the WBTU, or the WIFM, of a speech. WBTU, of course, is why bring that up. WIFM is what's in it for me. LEDs under plastic didn't matter to this customer. Time with her mother did. And as a speaker, you need to be clear about what matters to your audience and to help them understand why they should care about what you're saying. When you speak with your audience, the details that make up your plan or topic don't matter at all unless you connect that idea to what the audience members personally want and need. And when you do that, when you make those connections, you become a more effective speaker. So, if storytelling matters so much, how can you get better at it? Well, here are 7 things that you can do. First, identify 3 stories a week and write down a 1-line summary of each. They could be things that happened to you, that your friends or family experience, or that you learned from others. Don't try to get only good stories. If you're just starting, give yourself a break and worry mostly about quantity. Oftentimes we can easily get distracted by trying to do the best we can and trying to only get the best stories possible. But like I talked about a few episodes back when we talked about writer's block, when you're just starting, when you're stuck, just go ahead and focus on quantity. Just collect stories. Second, listen to the stories that other speakers tell and ask yourself why those stories work or why they don't work. Try to go beyond just the level of the story that the speaker is sharing, because the speaker is trying to make their own point. But as you're building your storytelling skills, you want to not only collect your stories, but you also want to understand what the speaker is trying to do. It may take you a little bit out of the moment, but one of the ways to become a better speaker is to take that meta approach to listening to other speakers. Listen to what they do. Figure out why it works and why it doesn't work. Find the approaches that are going to work most effectively for you and keep those. Make notes about those. So listen to the stories other speakers tell and figure out why they're telling them, why those stories work or why they don't work. Third, Share stories with your colleagues so that everyone has more stories to tell. You see, when you're telling stories in a speaking context, it's best if they're personal stories, but they don't always have to be. For example, that salesperson shared that one story with me, and I've been able to incorporate that into what I do as a speaker. Share stories with your colleagues. Let them use your stories and figure out which stories that they have that you can incorporate into your own presentations. Now, I don't recommend lying or saying that a story happened to you when it actually happened to somebody else. Once you start doing that, sure, there may not be an ethical concern about it, since it is just a story and you're taking some creative license with it. But once you try to take ownership of somebody else's story, it can affect your own confidence and the way you tell it at a subconscious level. There's nothing wrong or less effective about telling your audience, here's what happened to one of my coworkers. Here's what happened to one of my colleagues. Here's what a salesperson told me about. Your honesty and your integrity really make a difference in how convincing you are with your audience. And if you're not confident in what you're saying, that will come across. So feel free, share your stories with your colleagues and listen to their stories as well, so that everybody has more stories to tell, and figure out how to incorporate them into your stable of stories as it grows ever larger. Fourth, choose one of your stories each week, your favorite of that particular week, of those 3 you collected in step 1, or stories that you learned from other folks or observed from other folks, and write it out in detail. Be sure to talk about the emotional components of it as you write that out. The very fact that you write it out will help cement it more in your brain. It will mean that you are thinking about it, that you are already getting some practice at how you're telling that story just by writing it out. And as you write out a different story each week, you'll become more comfortable with those stories. You'll become more effective at incorporating them into your future presentations. Fifth, list 5 different topics, presentations, speeches, or circumstances in which you can tell that story. Among those 5 presentations, maybe is a topic or presentation you don't typically do. But this exercise will mean that you are thinking about the different contexts in which different stories can fit. And then one day, when you do need to conduct one of those presentations, you'll already be one step ahead because you have some stories you've associated with that topic already. 6, after listing out the different speeches and topics in which you can tell that story, list out the actual emotions or feelings that that story evokes. This way you can become more comfortable with the context of that story and how an audience is likely to respond to it. Be prepared to think about that, because when you tell a story that is going to evoke an emotional response from your audience, you also want to make sure that that emotional response is appropriate for what you're talking about. And 7th, for your next talk, challenge yourself to incorporate at least one relevant story. So those 7 tips again for improving your storytelling skills are: 1, write down 3 stories a week and write down a 1-line summary of them. 2, listen to the stories other speakers tell. 3, share your stories with your colleagues so everyone has more stories to tell. 4th, choose one of your stories each week and write it out in detail. 5th, list 5 speeches, situations, or circumstances in which you can tell that story. 6, list out the emotions or feelings that story evokes. And 7, in your next talk, challenge yourself to incorporate at least one relevant story. So that's an introduction to storytelling. You'll notice that I talk about storytelling a lot. It's been an element of a lot of the different presentation topics and discussions I've had in previous episodes. And that's because it is such an important element of public speaking. And you'll continue to learn more about storytelling in future episodes. So that brings us to our call to action for this week's episode. And there are 6 things I'd like you to do. First, work on your own storytelling skills using the tips I already talked about. If you don't remember all of them, that's okay. You can find the list at 2minutetalktips.com for episode 25. Second, do you have a favorite story that you like to tell? Let us know in the comments at 2minutetalktips.com, or you can leave voice feedback at 650-TALK-TIP. You can call anytime. Don't worry, I won't answer the phone. It will go straight to a recorded voicemail. 3. Sit up straight in your chair for your next important phone call. 4. Go ahead and subscribe to 2-Minute Talk Tips in your favorite podcast app if you don't get it automatically every week. 5th, if you found this topic interesting, please share it with a friend or a colleague. 6. Becoming a great storyteller takes work, but remember, you don't have to become the best storyteller overnight. Don't get best. Get better.